All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the seventh episode of the FME Server webinar series. My name is Marc-Olivier Bourdeau. I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. This is the third and last episode of the self-serve module, and we're going to talk about the REST API. If you have any questions, you can send them using the Q&A section on your left, and I will try to pass them along to my guest, and you'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Feel free to ask anything. That's the advantage of watching webinar live, is to interact with us. So feel free to ask any questions that would come to your mind, or if there's something that isn't clear or anything. We will also be sending the recording of this webinar by the end of the week, probably, if I'm good. And other than that, I hope everyone is staying safe right now, and that the context isn't affecting your operations too much. Here at ConsorTech, we're still open, and we are all working remotely. But if you have any questions, or if you need coaching, or if you finally want to start that project that you've been postponing for over a year now, well, give us a call or send us an email, and someone will contact you, and we'll be glad to help. This applies too for the marketing side of our business. So if you have any content ideas for me, or anything that you think would be interesting to write a blog on, or whatever, maybe a success stories or a project idea, send them along. We're currently working on all the content or all the marketing we can do throughout the year. So pass them along, and I'll be glad to see how we can answer your questions. So without further ado, today's guest speaker is guest speaker or presenter? Oh, I guess presenter is Patrick Connolly-Boutin for his second presentation in this webinar series. Patrick is a GIS data integration developer here at ConsorTech. So Patrick, your turn.
All right, thanks, Marco. Let's start off with a quick question for everyone, and at the same time, I think it'll allow us to test the raise hand functionality of the webinar. Marco, where is it that people can raise their hands in the app?
It's literally on their left. There should be a little option, and yeah, we see some people. We see Linda, Chris raising their hands.
Okay, perfect. All right, I see them. So my question for you before we get started is, how many of you, by raising your hand, have utilized the FME Server REST API? Just a quick show of hands. All right, so we have a few. So I think for most people in this webinar, it seems to be sort of a new concept, so something that's totally new to you, and hopefully you'll learn a thing or two. We do have some use cases that were pretty fun, that we've sort of either developed for specific projects, or we're sort of like to those use cases. But for me, the REST API, like the FME Server REST API, at least, has been sort of an eye-opener, and has really made developing and sort of building these end-to-end workflows a lot more robust. So just a very high-level breakdown of what the agenda is for today's webinar. I'll start off by briefly describing what is a REST API, then how to interact with the FME Server REST API, how to handle responses, and last but not least, well, it's not necessarily last but not least, but I will be showing a few use cases, a few demonstrations on how we actually utilize the REST API. So for those of you familiar, or maybe not quite familiar with FME's integration platform, we've basically got three main applications. So we've got FME Desktop, where we're actually developing these workflows. FME Server, we're actually enabling these automation functionalities through triggers and notifications and whatnot. And lastly, we've got FME Cloud. So think of FME Cloud as an FME Server instance deployed on the cloud. For those of you that are staying in tune with the new developments on the FME side, SAFE has actually unveiled that they were thinking about deploying FME Cloud not only on AWS servers or instances, but also on Microsoft Azure. So that might very well be interesting for those of you, especially for those of you that actually want to use FME Cloud and your enterprise or Esri enterprise databases, because you very well know that if you have Esri, you cannot deploy it on an AWS, but Azure, that you can. So there we go. All right, now. For those of you that have attended these webinars in the past, this is sort of like one of our default slides. But I think I really like this slide because it sort of shows where SAFE is going with their data integration tools. We can see that they're sort of steering towards a fully web-based application. I don't know how long that's going to take. But especially with this automation's functionalities built in FME Server, we can see that the way that we develop automations is very similar to the way that we develop our FME workspaces in FME Desktop. Notice the little boxes, the little connectors, and then you double click, and then you get the parameters and whatnot. So I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more of the functionalities that we have in FME Desktop deployed on FME Server through this interface. But again, I'm not sure how far they're away from that. So first, what is a REST API? Well, to put it plainly, a REST API allows a user to interact with a server or a system by creating requests and receiving those responses from those requests. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and API stands for Application Program Interface. So a REST API is a type of API that follows a REST architecture. REST APIs follow these 6 architectural constraints. The first one being client-server. So client-server means that the client and the client application and the server application have to evolve separately without any dependency on each other. Uniform interface means that a resource in the server side, resource should have only one logical URI. It shouldn't be too large and should follow specific guidelines like link formats and data formats. So, when we think about data formats, we think of either JSON or XML. And all of them should be accessible through a common method like HTTP GET or HTTP POST or PUT. We'll look into a bit further detail as to what the differences between these methods are. Stateless. So stateless means that the server is not going to store anything about the latest HTTP requests made from any number of clients. So it's basically every request is treated like a unique and new request without any historic information that is stored from previous ones. The cacheable constraint means that the resources must be cacheable on the server or a client side. So think of, let's say, when you make a request, it returns you something. You must have the ability to cache that response on the client side. So for instance, let's say like a token. You generate a token, which we'll see a little further on. We generate a token to authenticate, to basically allow access into the application. And then basically our subsequent calls to the application or to the API, that is, will be able to use that same token value for authorization. Next, layered system. So layered system means that you can use a layered architecture when deploying a solution on different servers. So for instance, you can have the API on server 1, the data, like the system data on server 2, and let's say like the request authentication could happen on another server. So ultimately what this means, by layered system, it means that the client, so basically when you make a request from, let's say, like a web browser, you shouldn't be able to tell which server it's actually connecting to. That should be sort of like seamless as well. And last but not least, code on demand. Now, I, for one, don't really know any actual applications that use this functionality, that use this constraint. It is an optional constraint. It means that the APIs, they have the ability to return executable code to feed an application. So for testing purposes, a lot of people use some type of REST client. It basically allows you to properly format requests before implementing them in your solutions. So I will be showing one of the demos, and we'll be using Postman as a REST client to make calls to the FME Server REST API. All right, so how do we interact with the FME Server REST API? Now, before jumping into the demo, so what I'll be showing is sort of the documentation on the FME Server REST API. But before I do that, I'm just going to go glance over some of the general concepts when interacting with the REST API. Usually, the first thing that happens is the request, by some way, shape, or form, you're actually generating a token. Some requests don't actually require you to authorize. So typically, that is, let's say, like I know that for some requests, like let's say getting a health check, you don't necessarily need to get to ask for a token. You can just make the request and return something. When we talk about the types of calls, we'll look over that in further detail a little later on, but there are primarily 4 calls that with the FME Server REST API that are used. So there's the get, there's post, there's put, and there's delete. And for each request, you can either set parameters and set headers and authorizations. So typically authorization happens in the header, but we'll see in different contexts, we can actually make so set an authorization within a header. So let's just circle back. Let's just go to one of our examples here. I've got Postman here, and I will also open up a window to our FME server. So let me just log in here. So I'm logging in. For those of you that have FME Server, that have used FME Server, you'll notice that within the home page, there is a section here, the help section, where you can actually access the REST API. So you can also access it by clicking on this little question mark and then clicking on REST API. So what that does, opens another tab and gives you a brief overview of what the FME Server REST API is, and also the different types of calls that you can make. So notice they are categorized based on the types of calls, which items you're actually accessing within the system. So you'll notice here automations, cleanup, health check, and so on and so forth. What's really fun with the REST API is obviously you can programmatically make calls to build these end-to-end solutions, utilize some of the functionalities in FME Server without actually having to access the user interface. On top of that, what you can also do is make requests that wouldn't necessarily be accessible through the FME Server user interface. So, for instance, what we'll be doing in the demo is we're actually going to do a get health check. So this is a health check to see if FME Server is properly up and running. It's a simple get request, but obviously this isn't really accessible through the user interface, because if your FME server wasn't up and running, obviously you wouldn't be able to make a health check. It's sort of a catch-22 there. The other one that I use, let me just find it here, metrics. So metrics is not a tool that you can, or let's say like an item that you can access through the user interface. You actually have to go through the REST API. So this basically generates an open metric format for, let's say, the number of queued jobs per job queue, the number of running jobs, the total number of completed jobs, and so on. So think of this as sort of a way to retrieve information to maybe, let's say, feed another system, let's say like a BI application of some sort, to basically monitor what happens on your FME server. So with each of these categories, you can see you can try it out. Trying it out would require you to generate a token. Now, what I've done for this, for the sake of this exercise, is I've actually created or generated a token prior to this webinar. So I went in my admin section here, so my user settings. This is my home page. I went on manage tokens, and then I actually generated a token. I gave it an expiration, so it expires at the end of the month, and I basically granted it all permissions. Now you'll notice that the token value is sort of a one-time deal. You can no longer access that token if you like after you've created it. So it gives you sort of like a one-time copy this token into your application. But usually with these web applications that utilize the REST API, we actually generate a token upon each request. So basically that token remains alive. It has a shorter duration. So notice this one is valid for, let's say, 14 days or 14 jours. That's kind of funny, Marco, like will expire 14. Yeah, it's sort of we call it Franglish.
How is it in French though?
I don't know. It's sort of like a browser / I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, but typically when you're building let's say like web applications or any type of application, and you're actually generating a token, that token would remain alive until that session has been completed. So we'll sort of see how we've done that in our last use case, where we've actually built an external application that makes calls to with the FME Server REST API to FME Server. So without further ado, let's look at how Postman works. So I for one don't use Postman quite a lot. I'm typically more of an FME developer, and I actually do my testing with FME. But this is great when you're actually doing let's say like let's say web development, and you're actually developing. You don't want to develop everything. All you want to do is test the functionality, test whether your calls are actually formatted correctly. You'll notice here that we do have a lot of different tabs here where we actually define either headers or parameters for each of our requests. So I'll start with the FME server health check. So you'll notice here that it is a get method, and I'm defining the URL, and I've actually retrieved that URL by looking at, obviously, the documentation. So every good API must have, I guess, clean and thorough documentation associated to it. So in this case, I actually just went down here, clicked on the health check, and said, all right, how do I format my request URL? Well, there it is right here. And then I see, well, what are the headers that I need to define? This one here, I believe it's an optional header. I think by default, it will return you JSON. So let's go ahead and test this out. I've set my authorization here. I don't believe I need this authorization, but I just plugged it in just in case. So this one is sort of like, this is the token that I generated, and this is the value that I need to feed to it. So FME token space token equals, and then the token value. So let's go ahead and test that. So two things here. I guess two main things. I get a response body. So you'll notice here my response body, I actually receive it back in JSON. I could say, all right, well, what does it look like when I return it in XML or let's say HTML? Not much difference here. I receive it back in JSON, so we can actually use the response body to then take further action if we need to. You'll notice here also the status code. So depending on the types of calls that you're making, you could either utilize either or depending on the call, you either take this one or that one. So let's say like either the response body, or in some cases, you don't actually receive a response body, you just receive the status code. So second example, in here, what I'm doing is I'm making a call to create a user in my FME server instance. So I'll start with the headers. Where's my body here? It's because I actually created it before. That's why. My bad. Okay, so I've got my my post method here. I will go in my let's cancel. All right. We'll open this one again. Open a new tab. There we go. Okay. So don't save. All right, so now I'm using a post method. This is the URL. I'm defining my parameters. So basically I'm creating an item in, and the item is a new user in FME server. I'm defining what that user, what the email for that user is, if it's enabled, what's the user's full name, and then what will be the username. So in this case, I think that user exists. So let's do user, let's say name, Concertech12345 FME server user. And then we can set the password and its roles. Next, we'll go into the header section, and then we will define, this one's important because in order to access that functionality in FME server, we need the proper authorization. So this token is, you might have noticed back in the UI, I actually granted it all permissions. So it has access to all of the functionalities in FME server. You can generate a token that has a specific use as well, and you can define that in the permissions. So if I create a token using a user that only has access to, let's say, running a specific number of repositories or workspaces in certain repositories, then they won't see what else is there. So if they try to run a workspace that is in a repository that is outside their permission level using that token, it's going to return them probably a 401 error. So you'll notice here, I'll just click on send, and then I should get a status here. So 201 created. And then you'll notice here, I don't actually have a response body. So in this case, with the post method for creating a user, I would actually just use the HTTP status code. So let's quickly take a look at what happened in FME server. Did we actually successfully create it? I would assume that we did because we got a 201 created message. So there we go. There it is. Concertech12345 FME server user.
We got some questions for you, Pat.
Sure.
Graham is asking, is Postman free?
Yes, it is a free tool. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think you just go, I mean, you can quickly Google Postman, should be one of your first hits. And yeah, I mean, if it's if you have to pay for it, I know I'm not, so I might I would expect it to be free. Yeah.
And Graham also asked, does FME have a similar user interface?
So Graham, I think you're wondering about this, like a similar user interface to make requests. If that's the case, we can always test out these functionalities. Not all REST APIs have these functionalities. What's nice with the FME Server REST API is for any request that you make, you can actually try it out. So in this case, for here, let's see here. I'm going to copy the token value. Oops, there we go. Hopefully this works. Bear with me for a moment. I will just plug it in here, and I'm going to try it out. There we go. So this is sort of like the interface that you can use to test out these requests, which sort of brings me to my to the next slide here. Is like I mentioned earlier, you can actually test out these functionalities or these calls within FME Desktop as well. So I guess the tool that you would use, or the transformer that you would use in this case, would be the HTTP caller. So this screenshot is taken from one of the use cases that I'll be showing a little later, and this call is actually to get a list of automations that are currently deployed on that FME server. I guess, well, the URL isn't here. It's basically it's a parameter here, but it's our own internal FME server. We're actually running this, and it would return in JSON format a list of automations that we currently have set up there.
Quick question too. Well, which tool do you prefer when testing API calls?
I would say
Postman
like
or FME?
Well, I would say to test out these calls, I prefer FME, because typically what I do is develop solutions that utilize the REST API with FME. However, there are some cases where I would rather use Postman if I'm actually developing, let's say, like a web application. And yes, I could test out the solution in, let's say, I guess some type of application, like a development application, let's say like Visual Studio, for instance. But in that case, if you just want to isolate the testing of your requests to the REST API, and you're building a web application, then maybe Postman would be a better application to use than FME. But if you're already developing an FME, and you know that that's going to be sort of like the I guess the platform where you'll be running and making these requests from, then you might as well just develop it in FME. All right, next, how to handle responses. So the content of the response will depend on the HTTP method. So the HTTP method, like I mentioned earlier, could be it's primarily with the FME Server REST API: get, put, post, and delete. So when you think of get, you're actually getting the result of the request in question. So let's say you want to get automations. It will return the automations if you've set up your request properly. You could have it returned in JSON or in XML. However, if you're, I guess the standard or the default would be JSON in many respects. Think of a put like an update. So basically, you're updating an existing item in your system. So in this case, in FME Server, and what you would get as a result is either the status code, or sometimes the response body. But more often than not, you're actually using the status code to ensure that the request was done properly. The same thing would apply for the post method. So posting would be to create a new item in FME Server, or in any REST API, that is. And typically we would use the status code to ensure that our request was properly made. And similarly for delete, you're actually deleting an existing item. And also in this case, you would be using the status code more often than not. So there are a few screenshots here. We're actually listing the results. So the response body on the left-hand side is a result of that get request to retrieve a list of automations on our FME server. And you'll notice here for each type of request, so let's say you're requesting, let's say you're posting something, let's say you're creating a user or you're creating a repository, well, the status codes might differ. But more often than not, if it's within the 200 range, you know that the request was done properly. On the right-hand side here, I'm actually showing a response body with no content. And in this case, we would actually just use the response code. So in this case, 204, if we look at the documentation, it was a success. The workflow was updated. So in this case, it was a put of some sort. All right, now let's dive into some use cases. I do have 3 use cases to show. One would be to show how we've actually utilized the FME Server REST API to add some functionalities to either turn on or off a specific project. So a client of ours we've actually developed a solution for a client that comprised of numerous automations that we've set up on FME Server. And the client, instead of manually turning off all of these automations when they did not use the project or when the project was not in use, because the project was running on a specific window. So let's say like within, I think it was like 8 months out of the year. So it wasn't running in the winter, essentially. And what they wanted to do was create a quick tool that would just turn on or off all the components of that said project. The second example, what we've done was as part of our I think it was one of our sales trips. Yeah, we had a workshop, and what we did was we had a lot of people sign up after, or actually just before the start of the workshop. So what I did was I created this tool that was deployed as an FME Server app. So for those of you that have assisted or sort of viewed the previous webinar series on FME Server apps, this might be familiar because we've actually created an app to create users or have users create users for themselves within that FME Server instance. So essentially what that allowed me to do was to avoid having to manually enter each user, especially that there are quite a few to add. And last but not least, the third example that I'll be showing, the third use case, is actually an external app that we've created that we've developed for a client that actually makes calls to the FME server through a web application, external web application. So it goes from logging in to listing the items for that specific user in the app. All right, so let's jump into the first demo. So I've got a workspace here. Just making sure that everyone can still see my screen. Sometimes it's a little choppy. Marco, are we good there?
Yep.
All right, cool. So pretty simple workspace. You know, I don't have a lot of transformers. I've got, but you'll notice here, I've got 2 HTTP callers. I'm making 2 REST calls. The first one being list me the automations through a get method. So I'm accessing, this is the screenshot that I showed in one of the earlier slides. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating an item for each, or I'm creating a feature for each automation that is in my FME server. And then the way I've developed this project is I've actually created a tag specific to that project. So the tag is properly named. I'm just searching through that list to find only the automations that have that specific tag. And then afterwards, what I'm doing is I'm updating that, that automation to either turn it on or off. So you'll notice here, if I open up the parameters, my upload body is just value equals, and then the value of my parameter value. So if I look at on the left-hand side here, open up my published parameters, it basically says activate or deactivate the program. And I've got, it's a choice with alias. So basically if it's activate, it's true. If it's deactivate, it's false. So obviously I'm not pushing the display name, but I'm actually pushing the value to with that REST call. So how does it look on FME server? Let's just go in our FME server UI. And the reason why I didn't deploy this as an FME server app is that everyone that has access to the URL of that FME server app would essentially have access to that to that workflow or to that solution. So I wanted to restrict access of the solution, basically activating or deactivating the program or the project to a set number of users. Obviously, the permissions level was on the repository itself, and seeing as though there are only a select number of people within that organization that had access to that repository, I was pretty confident that it wasn't going to be a problem for them. So in this case, it's a simple run workspace, set your parameters, and what I'll do is I will also, in a separate tab, just open this here. These are my, notice the tags here, and they are all disabled. So what I'm doing here, I will activate. And it should finish soon. There we go. All right, and now if I refresh the page, you'll notice that all of them are now set to started. So if I go back, I will just go and rerun this by setting the deactivate. And if we refresh, they should all be deactivated. So this is to sort of show you that you don't necessarily need to build something, you know, through a web application or an FME server app to utilize the REST API. It can basically just reside in an FME workspace, but obviously it has a specific, like there's a specific need for that one. In this case, we wanted to sort of bulk activate or deactivate all components of a specific project. Our second example is the create FME server user. So for those of you that have attended our last webinar, which who was giving that, Marco? Was that Felix or Leslie?
It was Felix, the sixth episode.
Yes.
On apps? Yeah, it was Felix.
Yeah, so Felix was sort of demonstrating how we can build FME server apps through workspaces. I won't go into detail as to how to create these apps, but basically when you're configuring the workspace, you can go in your advanced section and just click on, hey, I want to create an app from this workspace. This is essentially what I've done with this workspace. I will show you the workspace a little later, or right after this. And let's Marco, master of marketing. And
I like that.
You like that?
Yeah, sounds pretty accurate.
All right, so your new email address, Marco, is marcomastermarketing at concertech.com.
Is that official?
You'll have to ask Guillaume, but I think it is. I think that officially, yeah. So this workspace also officially changes your you're no longer what is it, Marco something at Concertech? I don't know.
Marco Olivier B. Marco Olivier B.
So you notice here that I've entered a password, and this was just to sort of control who, like I wanted, because it's a sort of a public facing. This isn't necessarily public facing. When I had the webinar, it was actually public facing because it was actually deployed on one of our cloud instances. I didn't want the URL just to go and be fully public without a password, because when you're actually setting or creating an app, it is open to everyone that has access to the URL. So just as a measure of security, I've entered a password that I had provided to the people that were in that workshop. So I will enter the password, click OK, and it's a lot faster than last time, eh? Mm-hmm. So we had the webinar in French earlier, and it took a little longer. So this workspace, it generates a report, and you'll notice here, this is the full name. I created a username 31 with Marco's awesome new email address, and I've got hey, it's been created. So let's go back and look at our users, and we should see a new user. User 31. So Marco, master of marketing, has now been created. So I just wanted to create like a quick way to add users, and obviously these are temporary users. So I mean, I could have developed a tool that would basically eliminate or delete all of the users that had been created for this workshop. So now if you look at the workspace, just scroll to the left here. I'll start with the password because it's sort of something I was wondering how I could actually set the password. Well, first and foremost, the users that we've created do not have access to this workspace, because if they did, they would ultimately render it unsecure. I'm actually setting the password here. So this is my confirm password as a private parameter. And then I've got my enter your password publish parameter. And obviously these need to match. So what I'm saying here is, all right, is the password that's entered by the user the same as what is entered by as a private parameter? If it's a yes, then proceed on. And if it's a failed one, then I'm actually generating a report that has, it's basically invalid passport. And I've set this workspace up as a data streaming with the data streaming service, which means that upon runtime, we will actually receive, or the result will be streamed to us. And in this case, the report is in HTML, so that that HTML page, obviously, it automatically pops up when the workspace is complete. So what I'm doing here very quickly, I am getting the users, and the only thing I want to get here is the total count of users. So this is in my response. I get I make a get. I receive a response, and I'm saying, all right, give me the attribute total count from the JSON response and create an attribute from that. So the value of that attribute will be the total count of users. And then what I'm doing afterwards is just validating whether that user exists by using the, it's using the full name. I could make it a bit more complex by using the full name and the email address. I just kept it pretty simple here. And afterwards, what am I doing here? I am creating an attribute or a username. Where's username? Is it here? No. Yes, okay. Notice here, so the name, this is the username, so it's user at value next user count. So I'm actually retrieving the value. So this is basically your total count plus 1 to basically not have duplicates in your users. And then in this HTTP caller, I am making a post to create a user. So if we do a comparison on the parameters that we've set with the HTTP caller in here, you'll notice email enabled, full name, name, password, roles, and so on, matches what we've set up in terms of the parameters here. Notice here, email, and so on. So again, this is sort of another way we've actually utilized the REST API in a workspace. And we've deployed it as an FME Server app. So that FME Server app obviously utilizes the REST API as well. So that sort of how it works is seamless to the user that's running that FME Server app. And so for our last example, I will go into the external app that we've built. Apologies for the French here. So it's one of our clients in Quebec. The sort of a background story behind this, they have a number of users. Yes, they are set up in FME Server, but those users were not necessarily familiar with the FME Server user interface. So what the client wanted, it was a simple portal that would list the available workspaces that user has permissions on. So it starts off with an authentication. So notice this login page. So I am logging in as a system user, but I could very well log in as an Active Directory user as well. So this login will actually generate a token. So that is the first call that I'm making. And notice the response, pretty quick. We're actually rendering the responses. They come in JSON. We're basically formatting to create these items in our application. So, I mean, like we've got these like pretty simple icons. We've got the workspace name. We can expand. And what is returned to us is the list of parameters for that specific workspace. And let's just here, what do we have here? Which one can we? Austin Apartments. Let's run this one. So I will trigger the call, and notice here this basically says the request has been successfully sent to the system. What we've done here is we've actually processed. This is a post method. We're actually launching a workspace using this button, and we are handling the return. So in this case, if it's like, let's say like a 200 return, we know that the call was made. Now, this isn't the result of the transformation. So basically the result of the workspace. But we could very well implement that, the results in, let's say, in this application if we wanted to. So let's just look at whether that workspace was run. So I'm back in my FME server here. I'll go in my completed tab. and you'll notice, oh my, well, this is interesting. So I've got my Austin apartments. The status is failure. So notice the success, like it was a successful call because we were able to trigger that workspace. But the result of that transformation is a failure. So what is, we'll just look quickly. Okay, so, oh, it's got an unsupported extension. All right, so sort of an unknown error. I won't go into too much detail. This is sort of, it's kind of funny because it's one of the workspaces that is provided by Safe Software when you're actually deploying FME Server. It's a little ironic that it's not working, but the other ones work. So just to go back in our presentation here, I do have a final slide that looks at the different calls that we've made from this external application. So upon login, we actually generate a token. So this is a sample of the request that is being sent. It's a post, and then we actually use that token value to get a list of all the repositories that user has access to using a get. We render it in the application. We basically format the text so it looks nice in our application. Then we get a list of items for each repository. So the items here are the workspaces. Next, we get for each workspace a list of published parameters. So we've got one post, 3 gets, and then we execute the job with the FME Server job submitter service. So in this case, we're actually making a call. It's a post using, again, the token value that was generated initially. All right, so I haven't taken a look. Are there any questions that came in, Marco?
Yeah, we got 2 right now. Feel free to send them some more. We got Ted who asks, I think you answered that one though. Can Active Directory accounts be used to log into FME Server?
Yes, absolutely. So our FME server is actually configured with Active Directory right now. So through the external application, what we've done is we've basically said, all right, FME server, you handle who has access to what. And it doesn't matter if it's a system user. So a system user would be a user that is created outside of Active Directory, or if it's an LDAP user. So basically, we've imported user groups from Active Directory, and we've created FME server users from them.
All right, we got Chris. Chris who asks, I saw that Safe will probably deprecate the FME Server JavaScript API soon. I'm looking to using these REST calls to build a Django application using Python. Are you primarily building web applications using JavaScript, or have you used a Python framework like Django or Flask?
And that's very interesting because it's sort of a segue into I guess my innovation project. So Marco earlier in this in the webinar, he mentioned that one of the was that in this webinar, Marco, or
now it's in the French webinar because
Okay,
the world tour is in French.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So we have sort of created this like an innovation initiative. So every technical expert at Concertech has basically a week to work on an innovation project that they hold dear. And what I've actually wanted to test out is how to build an application using Python and the Django framework or module to build these applications. So I've actually started doing that. And I mean, what's great with Django, I mean, what you can do is Django is more on the server side. So it will basically handle requests from your application, and it will store these requests. So it doesn't store the requests, but basically everything that comes from the application will be handled by Django. So I mean, what I'm looking into is whether to or how to basically build server-side calls from the, let's say, from the client to FME server, and utilizing Django as a module. So I would say, in a nutshell, yes. How do I do it exactly? That I'll still need to figure out.
All right. There's no more questions for now. You can, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just do the next presentations. Well, on May 13th, we'll have the final episode of this FME Server webinar series, Discover the Power of FME. That's basically a presentation that we built with numerous client projects and success stories. So now that you've gone through the whole webinar series and you've acquired new skills, we'll show you a few ideas and projects that municipal clients did across America. And also we're going to be giving some webinars with GIS associations. We're giving Next Gen 911 presentations for URISA Ontario members and the AGIC community in Arizona also. So if you have any questions, you can ask them. We're still live for a minute or two. Or if you, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, if you have any content ideas that for us, send them over. We have time right now to work on these projects, so it will be a pleasure. If you have more technical questions, you can send them to Patrick. We got Ted who asks, is there a Python API for FME server?
That is a good question. I don't think so. I don't think so, but I can look into it. I know that there's like the developer playground. I don't believe there is a Python API for it. Okay.
Well, we got your email, Patrick. Maybe you can send the answer by email. Well, actually, Chris answered Ted. He said there isn't a Python request API, but you can just use request library.
Yeah. So I mean, like I guess you could, yeah, exactly. So you import that library, and then you can basically make requests using in Python.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll see you at the next episode. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.